This is Maya Van Rossum. I'm the Delaware Riverkeeper. My organization is the Delaware Riverkeeper Network. And on behalf of all of our speakers and the organizations that put together this webinar, I would like to welcome everybody and thank you so much for attending. The Beyond Extreme Energy, Berks Gas Truth, Food and Water Watch, Delaware Riverkeeper Network, and Green America are the organizations that worked really hard to try to put together this webinar this evening to give you some updates on some really critical areas having to do with frac gas pipeline projects. As you know from the agenda, which is why you signed up, we're going to have 4 speakers this evening. We're going to hear from Stemplewicz. He's the senior attorney with the Delaware Riverkeeper Network who does all of our pipeline litigation, and he's going to give us an update on recent goings-on with regards to litigation around FERC frac gas pipeline projects. We've got Scott Edwards with Food and Water Watch, who's really going to talk with us about the most recent legislative proposals and the dirty energy legislation that is being advanced or attempted to be advanced through various segments of Congress. We've got Drew Hudson from Beyond Extreme Energy, who's going to talk with us about FERC and some of the most recent pipeline battles and what is happening on that front. And we've got Feridun with Berks Gas Truth. He's going to talk with us about how you can get more active and more involved with some recent opportunities coming up in the next couple of weeks. With that, I am going to quickly turn it over to Stemplewicz, Senior Attorney with the Delaware Riverkeeper Network.
Great, thank you, Maya. My goal here is just to give you a quick update on some recent cases that have come down with regard to natural gas pipelines, particularly federal cases, to give people a little bit of lay of the land about what's going on, at least at the federal level with regard to case law. I'm going to really focus on three of the most recent cases that have been decided within the last couple months. Actually, they've all been decided this summer. Sierra Club v. FERC, Millennium v. the New York Department of Environmental Conservation, and Constitution Pipeline Company v. FERC. The first case I want to talk about is Sierra Club v. FERC, and this one potentially is the most meaningful of the three, and the one that I think people would be most interested about of the three. Sierra Club filed a lawsuit alleging various NEPA deficiencies in the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission's analysis of a large pipeline down south that crossed portions of Florida and Alabama and I believe Georgia as well. I think it was a 500-mile pipeline. And they made a number of claims regarding deficiencies in the environmental impact statement for that project. And the court rejected all of those arguments except for one, but that one was a very important argument. And the court essentially agreed with Sierra Club that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission needed to account for, in some way, the end use and combustion of the gas that is going to be going through the pipeline. Because it is, frankly, a very compelling argument and a common sense argument that it's very foreseeable that the gas that's going through a pipeline is going to end up somewhere, and it's going to end up being used somewhere and most likely burned. So it is only logical that any environmental assessment accounts for that combustion of the natural gas. Specifically, the court indicated that the significance of the indirect effect of end use must be considered, and importantly, the incremental impact of that end use when added to other past, present, and reasonably foreseeable future action. So it's a very important, decision. So essentially, FERC must account for the cumulative greenhouse gas impacts from the project and other gas projects in the region. Another important part of this case is, on remand, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission needs to explain why a certain methodology for qualitatively describing the impacts of this combustion is not appropriate. And this methodology is called the social cost of carbon. It's been used by a number of academics in the past. FERC has tried to downplay it in the past. The court decided not to determine whether or not it's a valid model because it wasn't thoroughly discussed in the record. So it's going to be a fight for another day. But that was an exciting development, very exciting development. And I think the logical outgrowth of that case is that there's going to be a lot of interesting litigation coming up in the future regarding, foreseeable greenhouse gas impacts and attempting to expand upon the finding and holding of this case. The next case is the Millennium Pipeline Company v. the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, or SEGOS. In that case, Millennium Pipeline Company filed a petition in the D.C. Circuit seeking to force the New York DEC to act on or find that it had waived Millennium's request for a Section 401 Clean Water Act water quality certification. And ultimately, in another good result, the court dismissed Millennium's petition and determined that Millennium must first ask FERC whether New York DEC waived its right to issue the water quality certification. So this essentially gets remanded back to FERC, which is very interesting. And Millennium is going to ask FERC that the New York DEC waived this, waived the 1 year or waived the right to issue the water quality certification. And the question before FERC is, when did that clock start? And I think there's some other good recent case law out there suggesting that clock starts when the application is deemed complete, in which case Millennium is really out of luck. An important consideration in this also is that FERC, in their interpretation of the Clean Water Act and whether or not the 1 year clock started and therefore New York waived their water quality certificate rights, their interpretation of the Clean Water Act is not provided any deference by federal courts. So in my opinion, FERC is going to be very hesitant to rule against New York DEC because they get no deference in court. FERC likes, when they litigate, to get deference. Any agency does, because that makes it much harder for the moving party to be successful. Whereas in this case, they would not get any deference. And that was for the specifically with regard to the Valley Lateral project. In the third case, Constitution Pipeline Company also sued New York State DEC with a similar claim, but they also argued that on the merits, the New York State's denial of a 401 water quality certification was arbitrary. And secondly, they argued that New York took longer than 1 year to decide. Frankly, I think it was a bit of bad lawyering on the part of Constitution Pipeline Company because the lawyers should have known that any failure to act claim or any waiver claim with regard to Section 401 waiver, that needs to be brought in not the Second Circuit, but the District of Columbia Circuit. And it's very clear from Section 717 RD2 that that's how that needs to proceed. And unfortunately for Constitution, and fortunately for the people, those of us opposing this project, they didn't bring that claim in the right court, so the court bounced that claim. And with regard to the other claim, that New York DEC's decision to deny the water quality certificate was arbitrary, the court found that New York DEC was more than justified because Constitution failed to provide adequate information for getting the water quality certificate approved, despite numerous attempts by New York DEC to get that information from Constitution. So that decision actually has been appealed en banc for a rehearing en banc before the Second Circuit. en banc panel rehearing requests are very, very, very seldomly granted. I think it's something like less than 1% of the time. So I think that, at least at the Second Circuit, is pretty well resolved. Now I just want to just quickly move on into some pending pipeline cases to watch in the upcoming months, and many of these will either be decided or get underway by the end of the year. And the first one has to do with the Atlantic Sunrise litigation, and there's, I believe, 4 lawsuits against the Atlantic Sunrise, against the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection for issuing a water quality certificate for the Atlantic Sunrise project, and that's before the Third Circuit. Those cases have been fully briefed, and we're expecting a final date for oral argument to come up probably sometime in November before Thanksgiving. Not sure on the exact date yet, and then a decision shortly after that. Another case is the Delaware Riverkeeper Network, and that should read versus the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. Penn East is an intervener in that case. And again, that's over a Section 401 water quality certificate. That oral argument is scheduled for October 12th and 13th. People are welcome to come. It's in Pittsburgh. It's October 13th, and that's scheduled in. It's going to be in Pittsburgh. Another case, a complaint was recently filed in the D.C. Federal District Court. The case is called Bold Alliance versus FERC, and it is a novel claim challenging the constitutionality of the eminent domain provisions of the Natural Gas Act. Nobody likes the eminent domain provisions. It's very unpopular. It's a very unique claim, and I think that it's fraught with some pitfalls that they're going to have to navigate. But it is. I think it's a great case to bring, and it's worth supporting. To the extent other groups are interested, I think people should consider writing amicus briefs on behalf of the plaintiffs in that case. Like, for example, we know for a fact that pipeline companies do not, by law, are not required to negotiate in good faith with landowners before they exercise eminent domain, which is frankly ridiculous. And I think these types of issues need to be heard by a court. The last case I've listed on there is one of ours. It's Delaware Riverkeeper Network v. FERC, and that is in the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. That case involves a challenge to the funding mechanism for FERC. And essentially the argument is that the FERC's funding mechanism, which basically requires that FERC is fully and entirely funded by the industry that it regulates, results in them being biased, or at least the appearance of bias, as being an adjudicator for approving pipeline projects. Initially, that case was dismissed at the D.C. Federal District Court, but we took it up on appeal to the D.C. Circuit Court because we believe that there are a number of issues that are ripe for appeal, particularly in light of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court's ruling with regard to the Environmental Rights Amendment, which we believe directly implicates some standing issues that were ruled on in that case. So that briefing is going to begin in, I believe, September 25th and go on for about a month and a half. And then oral argument will be scheduled in that case. Hopefully will be decided sometime early 2018. So hopefully that provides a little bit of lay of the land, and I'll be happy to answer questions after the other presenters are done. Thank you.
Terrific. Thanks, Aaron. I believe now our next speaker is going to be Scott.
Yep, I'm here, Maya. Thanks. There we go. Okay, good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining. My name is Scott Edwards. I'm with Food and Water Watch, and I was going to touch a little bit on some of the federal legislative action around pipelines and some of the bills that might have an impact on FERC and infrastructure build-out across the country. starting with the bad news is with the Trump administration and its extremely friendly posture towards oil and gas and all the oil and gas relationships that many of the administration has. The Republican Congress has been extremely active in introducing mostly bills, but also a handful of resolutions related to energy and gas, oil and gas development in the country. And many of them, as you can see from this slide, since January. This is since January of 2017, so we're only talking about 9 months now. There have been 181 bills introduced into Congress that have some impact on energy, and many of these are oil and gas bills. Again, most of them are fairly narrow. Some of them have involved simply individual projects, hydroelectric projects within states, but several of them touch on oil and gas infrastructure and gas build out in FERC. And so I'm going to touch on just a handful of those things. So the bad news is that the Republican Congress has taken a signal from this administration to go all out on trying to promote both oil, but certainly natural gas development and build out. The good news is, though, we have such a dysfunctional White House and Congress right now that the prospects that these bills are moving anytime soon are pretty small. I mean, we're not seeing significant amounts of movement on much in Congress these days, as I'm sure you all know. So the bills I'm talking about, it's really hard to guess which ones are going to move, how quickly there's going to be any kind of action taken on them, certainly on the Senate side, but I'll talk about that a little bit. But certainly we've got an administration, we've got a federal government right now that's looking to build out oil and gas here. My computer's not advancing. Oh, there it goes. For a little context before I start talking about the bills, though, I think it's important that to understand where a massive push is coming from in natural gas infrastructure build-out, and what is really driving right now in Congress several of the bills, if not all of the bills that I'm going to discuss in a second. We used to hear about the need to build out oil and gas and the need to build out natural gas and build all this infrastructure to create energy independence for the United States, to provide domestic energy capacity so that we can power U.S. homes and businesses. That's not what we're looking at now on all of these, on many of these new projects and this new build out. We are looking at a massive attempt to build out for export purposes, and this is both to Latin America and South America, but increasingly over to the EU, Asia. There is a huge effort going on to expand our export capacity. And as you can see from this slide from the Energy Information Administration, is we are now a net exporter of natural gas. So this is not for use in the United States. Many of these projects we're seeing right now. This is simply for export, and it's an important consideration when you are fighting these pipelines, because many of the arguments that they make is, and Aaron mentioned eminent domain before, that it is necessary to build out this infrastructure, to exercise eminent domain because it's for the good of the American people to do this, and we're going to take your land, we're going to take your property. Right? That's all nonsense. They're building out now and taking and exercising eminent domain, taking private property purely for profit. This is much of this gas now is going to be sent overseas. It's not for public use here in the United States. This is for pure profit and exports. So we are increasingly, and this is going to get worse and worse and worse as the years go by. And you can see from this graph how it's starting. But I've read one report just recently that estimates that if given just what we have now for planned export build-out, to meet that export capacity, by 2050, we will be digging into our natural gas reserves, 60 to 70% of our reserves to ship overseas just to meet that need with the infrastructure we're building out now for export. So given that push and that real focus on export, what we're seeing, again, my computer's not moving slides for me here. Oh, there we go.
I'm doing it for you,
You're
Scott.
doing it?
Just
Thanks.
tell me.
I'll let you know.
Yeah, just tell me when you need to go.
Oh, okay, thanks, Maya. So what we're seeing are bills being introduced into Congress that do a couple of things. And number one is making, if FERC's job wasn't easy enough already to just go ahead and rubber stamp these projects, there are several bills that are trying to even expedite FERC's current approval process and cut down on the amount of agency interaction from other agencies who might want to weigh in. But we're also seeing, again, going back to the export issue, a real concerted effort in many of these bills to expedite export build-out and export capacity. So on this slide, you'll see that I've mentioned 3 bills that are in the Senate right now. Certainly the one that has gained the most, I think, attention and perhaps has the most potential for some kind of movement. But again, it's hard to predict. We're looking at a Congress that's really not moving much now. But certainly the Energy and Natural Resources Act of 2017, a bipartisan bill, Cantwell and Murkowski. This is very similar to the energy bill in 2015 that did come out of the Senate and then got hung up and had a lot of bipartisan support. But it's back now in 2017 here. It is a bill that has some support mostly in the conservation community, because it does have some provisions on set-asides and conservation land. But for our issues, for fossil fuel and for natural gas specifically, it is not a good bill. It expedites approval of LNG export terminals. It expedites the review of oil and gas drilling and permitting at the FERC level. It designates FERC as lead agency for all authorizations for natural gas projects and makes all other agencies give deference to FERC. There's language in there about expanding and developing methane hydrates. So on our issues, this is not a good bill, and we've gotten a lot of support. We signed we submitted a letter and sent it off to Schumer, demanding that the Democrats stand up and oppose this bill, and we have over 350 organizations who signed on to that letter. And so, again, we've got our fingers on the pulse here. Certainly, there's not going to be any discussion of this bill, we don't think, this calendar year. But it's something we have to continue to watch. Out of all the bills I'm going to talk about, this is the one that I think, if a bill is going to move, perhaps next year, this is the one we have to sort of keep our eye on. The other bills listed here from Cruz and Cassidy, I see I misspelled Cruz, sorry, both have to do almost purely with this export issue. Again, these are senators, right, from Gulf states, Louisiana, Texas. It's no coincidence that much of the LNG export build-out is happening in the Gulf. And so these guys want to see these export terminals built and online and lots of gas flowing down from all over the country to these facilities. Both of these bills, the LNG Now, Gas Now Act from Cassidy basically terminates prohibitions on exportation and importation of natural gas. The Cruz bill is just simply an amendment to the Natural Gas Act to provide for expanded natural gas exports. Again, completely self-interested. Texas, Louisiana, trying to promote the LNG export industry in those states and on the Gulf. Again, shipping all of the natural gas overseas, a lot going to Europe these days. The next couple of bills are a couple of House bills that, again, do much of the same thing that these three Senate bills do. You've got another Republican out of Texas, Flores, and this is an interesting bill. He calls it Promoting Interagency Coordination for Review of Natural Gas Pipeline Act. What that really does, though, is it strips away much of the authority that any other agency other than FERC has over reviewing projects and approving projects and even having a lot of input into how these projects go forth. So it's really a way to simply empower FERC even more, puts timelines, strict timelines in place when FERC must approve it, and again, really minimizes the impact or the input from other agencies. The second bill there from Mullen in Oklahoma, in large degree, focuses on the presidential permitting that we saw that was exercised under the Obama administration on the XL pipeline. And what this does is it essentially gets rid of the State Department presidential authority to review cross-border infrastructure. And so they don't want a repeat of when Obama exercised that authority to shut down that pipeline. So this bill gets rid of that. It also, much like 2910 here, puts some permitting restrictions on FERC and says that FERC must approve importation and exportation natural gas projects from Canada to or from Canada and Mexico within 30 days of getting an application. So FERC, even if it wants to take a look at an application, which we know they typically don't, but they only have 30 days turnaround to approve one of these cross-border projects. And you can leave it there, Maya. I'll just say that these two bills, and actually leads into the prognosis one. These two bills have actually passed out of the House, which is not a huge surprise, right? And things will move out of the House, particularly bills like this. So there has been movement on these two House bills. They've passed out of the House just recently, this summer. They will now go to the Senate. Again, we don't anticipate that there's going to be movement in the Senate on these things. The two other Senate bills, the Cruz and Cassidy bills, were just introduced in June. Again, we've seen no movement. If you go to the tracking website for bills, they actually have a prognosis number for bills. These two Senate bills their prognosis is 1% of passing at this point, which doesn't mean a lot. It's just because they were just introduced, and who knows, so that could change. But again, in the Senate, nothing's moving anytime soon. And I've already talked about sort of the Cantwell-Murkowski bill, and what that might look like. And so we are going to keep our eye on that bill. Again, we don't expect anything this calendar year. But the folks who in our lobby shop, Patrick and Liz, are going to keep a very close eye on that. And I just want to finish up. There's not another slide, but I just want to finish up by reemphasizing, from our perspective, one of the most important things we can do now to fight the expansion of gas infrastructure in this country is on this export business, because this is where the companies are going to make a ton of money and where they're looking to build out. And so these are the bad bills we're seeing. We just worked very closely with Tulsi Gabbard this summer, who on Friday introduced and today announced a bill called the Off Fossil Fuels Act, or the OFF Act, in which we are seeking a ban on export of fossil fuels from the United States, and that effectively would end all of this extra build-out they're looking at to ship fossil fuels overseas. And that's it for me, and if I hear anything else on these bills, I'll happily share that with Maya, and she can circulate that information. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Scott. Now we turn it over to Drew.
Great. So hey everybody, I'm Drew Hudson. I'm one of the original folks from Beyond Extreme Energy, which has been fighting FERC and fracking, but FERC in particular, for a couple of years now, since about 2013, 2014 when we first got together. So I'm going to run through a quick update about what's been happening with FERC in particular, because there have been some comings and goings in the last month from their commission. And as you've heard from our previous two presenters, that has a lot to do with what gets approved or permitted in terms of natural gas and especially frac gas infrastructure. First note, there's a good article my colleague Ted Glick put me onto in Politico. This is the headlines. You can go Google it later, and we can put links to it in the notes or something like that. But go check this out if you want the overview of what's been happening at FERC for the last couple of months. This is a pretty good article from Politico that sums it up. And it really does a good job of addressing our main concern, which is billions of dollars of pipelines have been stalled while FERC has been without a commission. So go check out this article, and the next two slides have some more data from them. So first, what do we mean when we say $13 billion in projects? As Scott was just saying, a lot of this it's about infrastructure, which is primarily designed to export fracked gas abroad. Especially, they would like to get it to the European market. Right now, most of it is going to South America and a little bit to Asia. But this is a kind of brief overview of a handful of the biggest pipelines or biggest projects that have been stalled. They include the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, the Mountain Valley Pipeline. Those both, Mountain Valley runs through Pennsylvania, Atlantic Coast runs through several states, kind of comes out of the edge of Pennsylvania or West Virginia, and then down through Virginia and North Carolina. The Nexus Pipeline, Penn East, the WB Express, Delphin LNG is a big export terminal, so these are a couple of the big ones. And you get an idea that the jobs numbers there, I should say, if you've ever worked on a natural gas project or a frac gas project that's proposed and in front of FERC, the industry always likes to inflate their job numbers. We used to make fun of this a lot on the Keystone fight as well. When they say that there are 10,970 peak jobs, for example, on the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, they're counting, everybody who works in fast food for 100 miles on either side of the proposed pipeline route, because they're assuming that those folks will get more jobs as the pipeline construction continues. There was even a famous example I think it was actually in Pennsylvania, where someone used a job estimate that assumed that there would be an increase in prostitution from pipeline construction agencies. So just to give you an idea how ridiculous the job numbers are, they count everybody, including drug dealers and prostitutes and people you probably don't want in your town as a regular employee in the job estimate numbers. But the good news is, while FERC has been without a quorum, so a couple months ago, right around the time Obama was leaving office, there were a series of resignations. There were first some resignations of Republican commissioners before Obama left. They basically left the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to take higher paying jobs in the private sector, mostly working for companies that build frac gas pipelines and power plants and things like that. And then around the time Obama left, the chair at the time, a guy named Norman Bay, left. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission resigned his job as chair because he found out he wasn't going to get to keep the job as chair. He was going to get demoted to just be a regular commissioner. And so rather than be demoted, he just took his ball and went away. He also wrote this kind of interesting, almost apologetic sort of exit letter. You can go back and find references to it in the article that I linked there at the start and some other industry press. But when Bay left, he was starting to admit some of the problems that exist at FERC, and that we've been fighting about ever since. But when Bay left, they only had 2 commissioners left, and then since then, another Democratic-appointed commissioner, call it Honorable, has resigned as well, also to go take a higher-paying job working for the fracked gas industry. One of the themes you'll hear over and over again is that Democrat or Republican, it makes no difference. At FERC, everybody works for the gas industry, not for a particular political party. And it hasn't made much of a difference in the past 15 or so years which party nominees come from. They all pretty much end up doing the gas industry's bidding. And so when Honorable left, there was only 1 commissioner remaining. So for the last couple of months, it has just been 1 commissioner sort of holding down the fort, and that's not enough legally for them to pass orders and rulings to approve new pipelines. When you heard earlier Aaron talking about all the court cases that have required them to review environmental impact statements and things like that, all of those environmental impact statements require at least 3 commissioners on the job to be approved. And then most of the court orders have been ordering them to go back and redo some of those. So in order to do that work as ordered by the court, they would need at least 3 acting commissioners. And they haven't had it for the last couple of months. And that's created this kind of pile up of all this fracked gas infrastructure, which we think of as a good thing. It means that these pipelines aren't getting built. They haven't been progressing for the last couple of months. As folks have been saying in the comments, that has changed in the last few weeks. And so let's talk about that. While FERC was shut down, we the anti-frack gas movement, we the climate movement, were anything but quiet. These are just a couple, picked at random photos of different actions from the last couple of months that happened while FERC was either lacking a commission or in the process of losing its commission. So there's been a lot of different protests and fights against Atlantic Coast Pipeline and Mountain Valley Pipeline. Those are 2 of the biggest proposals that have been on hold while FERC didn't have a quorum. But there are a bunch of others. And you've heard, updates from Sable Trail, from Millennium, from a bunch of the other pipeline fights. Beyond Extreme Energy, as well as Delaware Riverkeeper Network, and lots of other folks have also been really active in fighting the putting in of new commissioners. So the 2 photos there of friends of ours getting hauled away by police officers. The top one is Ted Glick. The bottom left one is Lee Stewart. 2 other BXC folks who showed up essentially to protest each time that there was a hearing on 2 of the FERC commissioners that have been approved now. This was Neil Chatterjee and Mr. Powelson. And those 2 commissioners have since been approved, but before they were getting hearings in the Senate Environment and Natural Resources Committee. And we showed up each time to protest and speak out against them. You can also see in the top left corner a picture that's me at the far right end of the banner that says, "Senator Schumer, don't Trump our future." No on FERC nominees and no on dirty energy bill, which you heard Scott talking about a minute ago. A bunch of us were arrested, refusing to get out of the way and essentially demanding that Chuck Schumer and the Democratic caucus pay attention to FERC and frack gas issues. That was on August 3rd, and later that same day was the vote to confirm 2 new FERC commissioners and restore the quorum. So all this is a sort of roundabout way of saying FERC may not have had a quorum, but our movement had a quorum, and we've been speaking out and shouting about the dangers of frack gas and gas exports all over the place for the last several months, and trying to keep the agency shut down, because the longer FERC stayed shut down, the more delayed and backed up the process of approving new pipelines and infrastructure processes got, and that's been good for the planet, if not for the frack gas industry. So a couple of victories, I think you've heard about a bunch of these as well. While FERC was on hiatus, we were busy. One place we did a lot of work was protesting, especially at the United States Senate. So that was a bunch of the pictures in the last slide. And then a couple of these other ones where we've been active. The next couple slides are all about court victories. And I think you've heard about most of these now. So this was a headline from the Sable Trail ruling. One important note about why court victories alone aren't enough to stop frack gas infrastructure. Sable Trail, for example, The order was that they had to go back and review pieces of the environmental impact statement, redo parts of the environmental impact statement, but they've already broke ground, seized land, bulldozed through swamps and wetlands, done innumerable damage all through Georgia and the Southeast and into Florida on the Sable Trail pipeline. It's not done yet, and there are still opportunities to prevent more harm from being done through this legal victory. But one of the reasons why it's important to show up and protest and speak out, in addition to following the court proceedings, is that the court proceedings in and of themselves usually do not stop pipelines from getting built. There are very few examples where we've actually stopped a whole pipeline or stopped a whole gas export facility just because we sued over the environmental impact statement. But we are getting some good results on suing over environmental impact statements. Someone was asking in the comments about Millennium. That is one of the better news stories. They rejected a particular local water permit, but the ruling where they did it was interesting. The New York agency that reviewed it rejected the water quality permit, but specifically talked about FERC's inability to account for cumulative natural gas impacts on climate change. So kind of echoing the same verdict that we heard in the Sable Trail case. And that's led a lot of our lawyerly friends to be excited about the idea of being able to successfully sue FERC over this idea that they're not accounting for cumulative impacts on climate change. They're cutting up the projects into little pieces when they review them. They're not looking at the big picture, and they're not looking at what happens to the gas that goes through the pipeline as one really obvious example. And so both the Millennium permit review, which really was supposed to be a water quality permit, one problem with that is they'll probably get appealed because it was a water quality permit that was rejected, at least in part, based on climate change grounds, and somebody, including the pipeline construction agencies, will probably see a disconnect in that ruling. But it is great that we got a review, and that's one where we actually did stop the pipeline. That's on hold, at least temporarily, while some of that goes forward or gets reviewed and appealed. And then the most recent one just yesterday, a new lawsuit brought up on Atlantic Coast, again, the biggest individual pipeline project in terms of dollars being reviewed right now by FERC. And this is landowners fighting the eminent domain ruling for Mountain Valley and Atlantic Coast. Those two pipelines start at about the same place, and then one moves a little bit more laterally east through Virginia, and Atlantic Coast goes a little bit more south, cuts through Virginia, and then into North Carolina. So lots of different court rulings are going on, and that's where we've seen the most success. Unfortunately, the place we haven't had as good success is in protesting at the Senate. So here's a quick update on where things were. Like I said, a about a month ago, they were down to just one commissioner. Cheryl LaFleur was the last commissioner still acting at FERC. And there were two, Chatterjee and Powelson, both Republicans who'd been nominated by FERC, had been reviewed by the committee. They were approved by the committee in July before they went on recess. That was the part where Ted and Lee were dragged out of hearings, different weeks, two different hearings on them. And where we're protesting the review of these two very, very conservative. We should mention, as commissioners go, these are both Republican nominees. Like I said, that part doesn't make a huge difference, but allegiance or history of allegiance to the frack gas industry does make a difference. Neil Chatterjee for a long time was the energy aide to Mitch McConnell. He famously wrote the draft letter signed by a majority of Republican senators that urged Trump to get out of the Paris Climate Accord. And so he is an incredibly conservative, very reactionary nominee. If you could imagine, Steve Bannon as a energy commissioner, that's Neil Chatterjee. He's a really, really hardline Republican conservative nominee on energy issues, and that's why he got nominated by Trump for the job. Powelson is, in some ways, a slightly more moderate Republican, I suppose you could say, in terms of his approach to energy issues. But he was formerly a Pennsylvania energy commissioner and was the one who famously said people were waging a jihad against pipelines by speaking out against the dangers of frack gas and frack gas infrastructure. And it was not a religiously appropriate term the way he used it. He basically was accusing all of us and everybody else who protests pipelines of being a terrorist of some kind. And so those are the two folks that were initially nominated by Trump. They were both approved by the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, which reviews these nominations initially. Pretty overwhelmingly, a number of Democrats voted for their nominations, as conservative and reactionary as those two are. They were still approved with big majorities, including a number of Democrats voting for them. Still, a couple of Democrats did vote against Chatterjee and Powelson in committee, specifically Bernie Sanders, Senator Hirano from Hawaii, and a few others on the committee did, voice opposition to Trump's energy agenda there. But when it came up to the final floor vote on August 3rd, it was the day before recess, and the way that this essentially happened is Lisa Murkowski, who's the Republican chair of the Energy and Natural Resources Committee from Alaska, pulled a sort of procedural gimmick, which is she called for a unanimous consent nomination, which is a slightly misleading term. What it basically does is it gives each senator a very limited time to speak out and oppose the vote. And if nobody raises their hand in time, it's like a speak now or hold your peace kind of thing, then the nominees can be brought up on the floor without anybody else voting. And so if you go back and watch the C-SPAN clip of Lisa Murkowski's nomination on the floor of Chatterjee and Powelson, she's literally the only person in the chamber. There are no other senators there. Nobody else shows up to vote yay or nay. It's her and the acting chair at the time, and no one else present in the chamber to do it. That said, any Democrat or any member of the United States Senate could have raised their hand and said, hey, wait, stop. We want a roll call vote. We want more debate on these two nominees. That also didn't happen, but it was a really rushed kind of process, and it all happened on the same afternoon that a bunch of us were in the Senate with that banner talking about the dangers of FERC, talking about the dangers of frack gas exports and some of this legislation that expands FERC's powers. And despite, the presence of people shouting about it, getting arrested about it, sitting in the halls of the Senate saying, please pay attention to this, no Democrat or other senator raised their hand to stop Lisa Murkowski from ramming through those two nominees. So that happened early in August. Those two nominees are now on the commission, and what we're going to talk about next is these bottom two. The last two commissioners are about to have just had their first initial hearing in committee today. Folks were on hand to protest that, and I don't think Maggie is here necessarily to speak to it, but I can tell you that three folks did speak out in the nomination hearings on Kevin McIntyre and Rich Glick earlier today. So we opposed those. A vote has not yet been scheduled in the committee, but we expect it to come very soon. And it's all to the reason why we're going to show up later this month and protest at FERC. Now that they have their quorum back, they're scheduled to have their first hearing on the 20th. So,
and with that, we are transitioning over to Karen. Perfect.
Thank you. So I did want to talk about what's coming up. As Drew just talked about, we do have some work to do. One of the things that we had been doing for the last several weeks, as Drew indicated, was kind of focusing on the Senate, since the Senate's the group that gets to have these hearings and vote on these nominees. And so we were combining the message of don't support these nominees, take advantage of this quorum, in fact, and the lack of a quorum, and hold the hearings that we have been now calling on you to hold for a very long time. Of course, that's not what happened. So now that Chatterjee and Powelson are already in place, now that Glick and McIntyre will surely be approved, we can expand our focus back out to all of Congress, and that's what we plan to start doing on September 20th when FERC has its first meeting since January. They've been without a quorum since early February, so they really haven't had a meeting since the beginning of the year, and that means that we're going to be there when Powelson and Chatterjee are there for their first meeting. And so we want to make it very clear that we, still have every issue that we've ever had with FERC. We're even more concerned now that these rapidly pro-fossil fuel candidates have been put in place so that now they can, rubber stamp along with everybody else at FERC every pipeline that comes their way, which has been their tradition anyhow. So it's just making a bad commission worse to add these two to it. So we want to make sure that message is clear, but also say now, we absolutely need you to start addressing these abuses of power. I know a lot of you already know about some of the work that we've already done because your organizations have been part of it. But, there have been more than 200 organizations that for some time have been calling on Congress for congressional hearings because of well-documented abuses of power that cross all sorts of different lines, from conflict of interest to using tolling orders against the public to the eminent domain issue. I mean, so many. And we were very careful during our lobbying efforts when we were talking to the Senate in particular to make sure they had copies of everything. So they have all the information. Every member of Congress really has heard from us one way or the other. And so now it's time to start pressing again and to start making the case that this has really just got to stop. And I think some of these court cases that you've heard about a couple of times are going to be helpful to that end. But what we need to do is really show numbers. And so on September 20th, we're going to be there for that first meeting. There's going to be a rally that morning right before the meeting occurs. So from 8:30 till 9:30 a.m., we're going to be out front at FERC, and we're going to be rallying. We're going to have speakers. We're going to then go inside. As many people as can possibly go inside. If you prefer to sit outside, you can do that and continue to chant or whatever. But we want to have a lot of people in the room when the meeting occurs, and we want to have a little bit of singing entertainment for the commissioners while we're there. So it's nothing terrible, nothing arrestable, but we're just going to have a presence. And then we would like to go up to Capitol Hill to start talking to those members of Congress again. And so if you are interested in going up to the Hill and you're able to make appointments with your own members of Congress, that's even better. So please consider doing that. But either way, we'll be doing some drop-offs, and we have a great letter that you can sign on to. We have an endorsement opportunity on the next slide. I'll just go to that. For you to endorse this action coming up on the 20th. And most important, we have the forum that you can see here on the second slide for people who can actually attend and let us know what all you're interested in doing. We have all those various activities I mentioned, there for you to check off. You can attend the rally, you can go into the meeting, you can stand outside, you can lobby. So check off all the things you're interested in doing, and then we can try to figure out how to best move everybody around. But we also, because it's 8:30 in the morning in Washington, D.C., it's going to be hard for a lot of people to get there that morning if you live at any kind of a distance. And so we have information on there about how you can sign up to get a space, a mattress, basically at a church where we have had activities in the past. They're very generous to give us really inexpensive, lodging in Washington, D.C., an otherwise expensive town. I think it's $27 per person per night. There are 2 nights available, the 19th in advance of the meeting, and if you need to stay there longer or if you want to attend anything that's going on afterwards, you can stay there the evening of the 20th as well. So there are cheap lodging. We can provide linens if you need linens for the bed. You can provide your own if you choose. So, you really can't get through Washington, D.C. that inexpensively any other way. So it's really a generous offer from the church. And it's very close to FERC, so it's very convenient in that way. So you can check off that you need that kind of space, and we'll be in touch with more details when you fill out that form that the bit.ly link points you to. As I mentioned very briefly, above that is the one that you can use to endorse the action if your organization is interested in endorsing and hasn't done so already. If you're not an authorized signer for your organization, ask the organization that you're a member of if they've already endorsed, and encourage them to do so. And we're going to put a link in the notes that I hadn't already put on this slide. We're going to have, you'll see like a petition going around. There's going to be a sign-on letter for organizations that are floating around. We can put the links to that in the notes. And then finally, I just wanted to make the point that, we have a good showing on this call, and you're not necessarily all close enough in striking distance to Washington, D.C. to get there for the 20th. If you are, please, please come. If you're not, we're going to be tweeting at senators that day. We're going to be tweeting at members of Congress that day, from the House as well as the Senate. So, if you're online that day, there are ways where you can help even if you can't be there in person. But, of course, it would be ideal if you could be there in person. And so I think I see Maya sharing the sign-on link, and we'll have the petition going around. You'll see that. There is no link for that yet, but you'll see it shortly. I will start sharing it with all of you as soon as that goes live. And in the meantime, it's right at 7:30 now, and I do want to shut up in case you have some questions you wanted to ask. So those are the basics. So thank you very much for listening.
Terrific. Thank you so much to all of our speakers. They did a really great job. We only have a few questions. This is one question that Drew spoke to a little bit, but I do want to pose it to you, Aaron, just to put the period on the end of the sentence. Regarding the three main cases that you talked about, the question was, is the bottom line that all these pipelines are on hold and unable to proceed? Question mark. In other words, will they not happen? Do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Sure. With the Sabine Trail, or with the Sierra Club case, that pipeline, I believe, is already under construction. Unfortunately, the way that a lot of the FERC cases work is that litigation doesn't come to a close until construction has started, and that's partly a result of FERC's use of tolling orders, and basically delaying final agency action so that parties can get into court on time, which is itself that is currently being challenged in a variety of ways. But with regard to Constitution, that pipeline has not been constructed. I think it's unlikely it's going to end up being built. There's going to be a lot of litigation that needs to happen before that occurs. There are a lot of hurdles that Constitution needs to jump through. One is getting FERC to agree that New York DEC waives its water quality certification rights, and then if that happens, New York DEC is likely to sue FERC in federal court to try to prevent FERC from making that decision. And considering there's no deference, I think that Constitution is unlikely. With the Millennium Valley Lateral project, I think there's a little bit higher possibility that occurs, but again, there's going to need to be some more litigation and some more administrative action that needs to take place before that project can move forward. But right now, it's not built and unlikely to be built. And just to clarify, the Valley Lateral project and was actually recently denied a water quality certification by New York DEC as an administrative decision, and they did that partly based on the Sierra Club case. There is a related pipeline project called the Eastern System Upgrade Project, and actually, if you look at the mapping of those projects, the Millennium Eastern System Upgrade Project actually ends right about where the Valley Lateral Project shoots off of the Millennium line. And the water quality certification for the Valley Lateral Project was initially, it seems, a decision was due 2 days ago on the 5th, but it appears that New York DEC changed that date, and now it appears that they're going to be making a decision on that water quality certification sometime in October. So it'll be interesting to see if New York DEC takes a similar position on the Eastern System Upgrade Project as they did for Valley Lateral. I think there are some material differences in the environmental assessment that FERC issued for each of those projects that might lead New York DEC to rule differently on the two cases, but it remains to be seen what they're going to do. Clearly, New York DEC isn't very happy with Millennium because they've been sued a couple times by Millennium, so who knows? Does that answer the question, Mike? Oh, and one more case I want to talk about very briefly is one that was up in the comments, which is the, I believe it's the City of Boston delegation v. FERC case. And the oral argument in that case is coming up. And that's a really interesting case where some aggrieved parties are challenging a FERC certificate for a pipeline project, claiming a bunch of different deficiencies related to safety and related to a number of other issues. But One of the issues I find most interesting is a segmentation argument that they made that actually is based on one of our legal victories against FERC that occurred in 2014, where the circuit found that FERC unlawfully segmented a bunch of Tennessee gas pipeline projects into individual environmental reviews rather than reviewing them as a whole. And this City of Boston case to expand upon the ruling from the D.C. Circuit in that case, and I'm hopeful that indeed happens. There are some differences, but there's also a lot of good facts in that case, and I'm eager to hear the oral argument and see how that turns around. That one will be worth following for sure.
And Ann Finran, and just in response to your question that just came through on the ESU, in fact, after some evading of phone calls and changing of dates on the website and everything, it actually ultimately turns out that New York DEC issued the water quality certificate even before the deadline. They just never reflected that on the website, and they refused to return any of our phone calls to make clear what was happening. So that's unfortunate, and we'll be able to share that with folks that are particularly interested. One of the next question I think is I'm going to pose it to Scott, but I think Drew might have some additional thoughts to offer. So this question, Scott, is there value in contacting a member of Congress who does not represent you?
Yeah, there is some value, and it's probably limited. I mean, they're generally just looking at their constituents these days. But I mean, to the extent that we can, as you're doing, generate big sign-on letters or big movements, and express your opinions on these things and what's moving, it's certainly not harmful and can only be helpful. To the extent that they are your representative, it's even more important. It is. You deal with members of Congress now who won't even take messages. I mean, you go to their websites, you have to put in your zip code, and they screen out folks that aren't within their district. So it's tough to do. But I think what you're doing in the sign-on letter here and other sign-on letters we've seen is a great thing to do, where they see massive movements of people, and they're all getting flooded with these messages.
Great. Drew, do you have something to add?
Yeah, just briefly to say, it is generally true that it's always best to talk to your member of Congress, but this is also an issue where all of us should talk to. Like I said, party allegiance doesn't go very far, and neither does regionalism. There are gas infrastructure projects in almost every state. We didn't talk about much of the West Coast projects because they haven't had recent court proposals, but there are big export projects proposed in Oregon and Washington state. There's pipelines proposed in California. And every state has, some version of a frac gas pipeline and or power plant proposed for it. So everybody's senator and member of Congress needs to hear about this. They all are going to be asked to vote on some of the legislation that Scott was talking about. We don't think anything is moving very fast in the Congress these days. But if it comes up, everybody's senator and member of Congress, Republican, Democrat, Pennsylvania, or California, everybody gets to vote for it. So you should definitely be on record with your members of Congress saying that you oppose these projects and you want hearings into FERC's abuses of power.
Great. Karen, here's a question. Will other groups from other regions be participating on the 20th?
Everybody is welcome to be there on the 20th, and we know we already have several groups that are going to be attending. In fact, our speakers are going to be largely from some of the frontline community groups. So we have, for instance, people coming from New York, from some of the pipeline issues up there. We have some of the folks from New Jersey, specifically on the Penn East pipeline. I know that Drew had been talking to some folks. Ted Glick has been talking to some folks from the Virginia groups and farther south. So, we're trying to get a number of different groups there who can make it to D.C. That's the problem, is that, there's not a budget per se for helping people travel in great numbers to D.C. So that's why we're, asking people who can't physically be there, to be there with us in spirit and online and on Twitter in particular, going after these guys, via tweets. So, if you're anywhere nearby and you can make it, absolutely. We may also have, I'm not sure if you've heard back from anyone from Ohio, but since Nexus just passed, or it was approved, we were hoping maybe Paul from Ohio could come, but I just haven't heard an update, and I don't know if you have either, Maya. I know you're the one who had reached out.
Yeah, I actually am a little behind in email, so. Well,
I bet.
I'm sure.
Yeah, but that's the kind of thing where we've worked very closely with Paul for some time on a lot of this planning for these lobbying visits and things. So, and given, the status, that was the very first thing that FERC did as soon as they were reconvened. They didn't even wait for a meeting. They started approving the pipeline, So that was the first one they did. They put Rover back online, so, into construction. So, there's lots of stuff going on. We're hoping we can have good representation and talk about all these various problems, because it is kind of nuts what's going on around the country right now and how quickly they're, using their new rubber stamps.
Great. So I just want to end on a high note with one last question, because we only have a few more minutes. Actually, we're over time. But this was a question that I think that you're the one to answer, Scott, because it said, what about the new bill in Congress regarding renewables? Heard it through Food and Water Watch maybe 10 minutes ago.
Yeah, this was the one I mentioned, the OFF Act, and Tulsi Gabbard introduced it. And, I know most of you are familiar with the Bernie Sanders 100% by 20 by 50 Act. It's a really good bill. What we've been working on and Tulsi just introduced, and we've got about 100 groups, is a bill that is a lot more aggressive than 20 by 50, not so much 20 by 50 versus 2035. I mean, when you reach 100% is an important issue, but what's more important, and what we have in the 20 by 2035 bill, the OFF Act, is a 80% reduction, or an 80% renewables by 2027, because we understand that, and we think very, very strongly that if we wait till 2035 to get to 100, or even 2050 to get to 100, that's not as critical as what we do in the next 10 years on carbon, methane emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. Because at the current rate of emissions, we only have 5 or 10, 6 years, 7 years, depending on what those emissions look like, before we've crossed several tipping points in the climate change crisis that we're now facing. So it's a very aggressive bill. And of course, we'll get some criticism for being overly aggressive on it, but it's what the science supports and what we think needs to happen. It has no market-based control systems in it. Cap and trade has been stripped out. It's very environmental justice focused, and has a lot of just transition and worker transition provisions in it, and protections for environmental justice communities. So the bill just introduced, and we're going to be working it hard over the next several months.
Terrific. So I think with that, we're at 7:45, and so I want to thank all of our speakers, and I want to thank all of our participants, and I want to let you know that, again, we'll be sending out a link to the webinar to everybody who signed up, so you'll be able to capture all of this information. Thanks, everybody, for joining us, and we hope to see you on February 20th, or no, September 20th. September 20th. All right. Take care. Bye.